She hid her pregnancy from the CEO, but years later, fate reunited them and changed it all. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The morning sun filtered through the delicate lace curtains of Callista Monroe's modest apartment in Savannah, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floor. She stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug trembling slightly in her hands, watching her 5-year-old son Elijah chase butterflies in their small backyard garden. His laughter, pure and uninhibited, should have filled her heart with joy. Instead, it twisted something deep inside her chest, a reminder of the secret that had shaped every decision she'd made for the past 5 years. Elijah's dark hair caught the light as he spun around, his amber-brown eyes sparkling with wonder. Those eyes, they were his father's eyes, though the little boy would never know it. Callista had made sure of that. "Mama, look!" Elijah called out, holding up a monarch butterfly that had somehow trusted him enough to land on his small finger. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "Yes, sweetheart," Callista whispered, her voice catching slightly. "Beautiful and free." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 5 years building walls around their little world, protecting them both from a truth that could destroy the fragile peace they'd created. But lately, those walls felt more like a prison. Her phone buzzed against the marble countertop, the vibration sharp and demanding. Callista glanced at the screen, and her blood turned to ice. The law firm's name glowed back at her, Carrington and Associates. She'd been dreading this call for 3 days, ever since she'd received the initial email about a prestigious project opportunity. With shaking fingers, she answered, "Callista Monroe speaking." "Ms. Monroe, this is David Walsh from Carrington and Associates. I hope I'm not calling too early." The voice was crisp, professional, carrying the weight of New York ambition even through the phone lines. "Not at all. I've been expecting your call." The lie came easily now after years of practice. "Excellent. Mr. Carrington has reviewed your portfolio extensively and frankly, he's impressed. Your work on the Charleston Heritage Project was exactly the kind of innovative historical preservation he's looking for." Callista's grip tightened on the phone. Mr. Carrington. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, though it echoed in her mind every single day. Bennett Carrington, the man who'd given her one perfect night and the most precious gift of her life, though he'd never know it. "The project," she managed to say, forcing her voice to remain steady. "A complete restoration of the historic Beaumont estate here in Savannah. It's a massive undertaking, 6 months minimum. Mr. Carrington is personally overseeing the project, and he specifically requested you as lead architect." The words hit her like a physical blow. Bennett was coming to Savannah. Bennett would be working with her, side by side, for 6 months. The secret she'd protected so carefully was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. "Ms. Monroe, are you still there?" "Yes, This is quite an opportunity." Her free hand unconsciously moved to the small silver locket at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept from that night in New York. Inside was a tiny photo of Elijah as a newborn, and on the other side, a picture she'd never been able to throw away. Bennett and her, dancing at the charity gala where their worlds had collided for one magical evening. The compensation is substantial. More than substantial, actually. Mr. Carrington believes in paying top dollar for the best talent. Callista closed her eyes, thinking of Elijah's college fund, of the small leak in their apartment's roof she couldn't afford to fix, of the dreams she'd put on hold to raise her son alone. This project could change everything for them, but at what cost? When would I need to start? Monday. Mr. Carrington arrives this weekend to survey the property. He's quite eager to begin. Monday. 3 days to prepare herself to see the man who still haunted her dreams, who'd never known he'd left her with more than just memories. 3 days to figure out how to keep the most important secret of her life. "I'll take it," she heard herself saying, the words tumbling out before her rational mind could stop them. "Wonderful. I'll have the contracts messengered over this afternoon. And Ms. Monroe, Mr. Carrington mentioned that discretion is of utmost importance on this project. He values privacy above all else. Privacy. If only he knew how well she understood that concept. After ending the call, Callista sank into the kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Through the window, Elijah was now lying on his back in the grass, pointing at cloud formations and talking to his imaginary friend, a habit that both charmed and broke her heart. He was such a social child, always creating connections, always trusting, everything she'd taught herself not to be. She thought back to that night 5 years ago, when she'd been a different person entirely, fresh out of graduate school, full of dreams and possibilities, attending her first major charity gala in Manhattan. She'd felt like Cinderella in her borrowed dress, completely out of place among the city's elite. Until she'd met him, Bennett had been magnetic, intense, with those same amber eyes that now looked back at her every day through their sun. He'd approached her at the bar, complimenting her architectural insights about the venue, a restored 1920s ballroom. They'd talked for hours about preservation, about breathing new life into forgotten spaces, about the stories buildings could tell. When he'd asked her to dance, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. She'd felt beautiful, intelligent, desired in a way she'd never experienced before. The connection had been instant, electric, undeniable. One dance had led to dinner. Dinner had led to a long walk through Central Park. The walk had led to his penthouse, where they'd made love with a passion that had surprised them both. She'd felt, for one perfect night, like she belonged in his world. But morning had brought reality crashing down. Bennett's phone had rung incessantly, business calls, board meetings, a life she could never be part of. She'd dressed quietly while he took a conference call, and he'd absently handed her a business card, promising to call her. He never did. 2 months later, when she'd discovered she was pregnant, Callista had stared at that business card for hours. She'd picked up the phone a dozen times, had even dialed his number once. But the call had gone to his assistant, who'd asked her to state her business. The words had died in her throat. What was she supposed to say? That she was a nobody from nowhere who'd spent one night with their powerful boss? That she was carrying his child? So she'd hung up, packed her few belongings, and moved to Savannah, where her grandmother had left her a small inheritance and an even smaller apartment. She'd built a life here, humble but honest, focused entirely on giving Elijah everything she could. Now, fate was forcing her hand. "Mama!" Elijah's voice called from the garden. "Come see, I found a 4-leaf clover." Callista smiled despite her turmoil, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Her son, their son, was her miracle, her purpose, her heart walking around outside her body. Whatever happened with Bennett, whatever chaos this project might bring, she had to protect Elijah above all else. She stood, smoothing her simple sundress, and walked outside to admire her little boy's treasure. As she knelt beside him in the warm Georgia earth, Callista whispered a prayer to whatever forces had brought them this far safely. 3 days. She had 3 days to prepare for the storm that was coming. She only hoped their little world was strong enough to survive it. 3 time zones away in Manhattan, Bennett Carrington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city pulse with its relentless energy 43 floors below. His reflection stared back at him. Sharp suit, perfectly styled dark hair, the same amber eyes that had once sparkled with dreams but now held only calculated ambition. At 34, he commanded one of the most successful architectural firms on the East Coast, yet something indefinable gnawed at him constantly. The Savannah project files were spread across his mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The Beaumont estate restoration was personal, perhaps the most personal project he'd ever undertaken, but it wasn't the antebellum mansion's crumbling grandeur that had driven him to take on this challenge himself, abandoning his usual role of delegating to subordinates. It was her name on the recommended architect list that had stopped his heart. Callista Munro. Bennett pressed his palm against the cool glass, remembering another night, another window. 5 years ago, she'd stood in this very spot, wrapped in one of his shirts, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and rose. Her dark hair had fallen in waves down her back, and when she'd turned to smile at him, he'd felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd spent years trying to rebuild. "Mr. Carrington," his assistant's voice cut through the memory like a blade. "Your car is here for the airport." "Thank you, Rebecca." He straightened his tie, gathering the files with practiced efficiency, but his fingers hesitated over one document, Callista's portfolio. Her work was extraordinary, each project showing a deep understanding of historical architecture combined with innovative modern techniques. She'd grown, evolved, become everything he'd glimpsed in their conversations that night, the night he'd destroyed with his own cowardice. Bennett had replayed those moments countless times over the years. How she'd dressed quietly while he'd taken that damn conference call from Tokyo. How she'd waited by the door, clearly expecting something, a word, a promise, a sign that their connection meant more than just a single evening. Instead, he'd handed her his business card like she was a networking contact, too caught up in corporate crisis management to recognize the gift he was throwing away. By the time he'd resolved the emergency and turned to find her, she was gone. No note, no number, nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and the memory of how perfectly she'd fit in his arms. He'd told himself it was for the best. His world was mergers and acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and 18-hour workdays. He had no room for complications, for the kind of vulnerability she'd awakened in him. But in quiet moments like these, when the city's noise faded to white noise, he could still hear her laugh, still feel the way she'd traced patterns on his chest while talking about breathing life into forgotten buildings. The flight to Savannah was turbulent, matching his inner state. Bennett tried to focus on the estate's blueprints, but his mind kept drifting to questions that had no answers. Did she remember him? Had she moved on, built a life with someone else? The possibility sat like a stone in his chest. David Walsh had mentioned her work was local now, based out of Savannah. She'd left New York entirely, apparently. Bennett wondered what had driven her south, whether she'd found the peace that had always eluded him in the corporate world. The Beaumont estate was even more magnificent than the photographs had suggested. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like ethereal curtains, and the mansion itself rose from manicured gardens like something from a fairy tale. But it was crumbling, its beauty fading with each passing season, much like Bennett himself, he realized with uncomfortable clarity. "Mr. Carrington," a groundskeeper approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ms. Monroe called, said she'd be here first thing Monday morning to do the initial assessment with you." Bennett's breath caught. Monday? 2 days away. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times during the flight, but now, standing where he'd soon see her again, words seemed inadequate. "Thank you." He managed to keep his voice steady, professional. "I'll be ready." But as he walked through the estate's grand foyer, Bennett knew he was lying to himself. How could anyone prepare for confronting their greatest regret? How could he explain that he'd thought about her every day for 5 years, that he'd compared every woman he'd met to a memory that had only grown more precious with time? The weekend passed in a blur of surveying and planning, but Bennett's mind was elsewhere. He found himself driving through Savannah's historic district, wondering if he might catch a glimpse of her. The city was enchanting, all cobblestone streets and antebellum charm, but it felt like another world compared to Manhattan's steel and glass towers. Sunday evening, he stood on the estate's wraparound porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in watercolors. His phone rang, Rebecca with updates from New York, but for once, Bennett let it go to voicemail. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. He thought about the man he'd become in the years since that night, successful, wealthy, respected in his field, but also lonely, driven by ambitions that felt increasingly hollow. He'd dated, of course, beautiful, accomplished women who understood his world and its demands, but none of them had ever made him feel the way Callista had, like he was more than just his achievements, like he had depths worth exploring. A warm Georgia breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the scent of magnolias and possibilities. Bennett pulled out his phone and, for the first time in months, called his brother Nathan in San Francisco. "Bennett, everything okay? You never call unless someone's died or the firm's being sued." "I'm about to see her again, Nate. Callista, the woman from New York." A pause. Nathan was the only person who knew about that night, about how it had affected Bennett more than he'd ever admitted. "The architect? Christ, Bennett, are you sure you're ready for this?" Bennett closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 5 years of regret and what-ifs. "No, but I have to try to make things right. I have to find out if there's still something there worth fighting for. Just don't hurt her again, okay? And don't hurt yourself either." After hanging up, Bennett remained on the porch until the stars emerged, bright pinpricks against the velvet southern sky. Tomorrow, he would face the woman who'd haunted his dreams and see if they could build something real from the ashes of their brief, perfect beginning. He only hoped he wouldn't lose his nerve when morning came. Monday morning arrived with the oppressive weight of Georgia humidity and Callista's heart hammering against her ribs. She sat in her aging Honda Civic outside the Beaumont Estate's wrought-iron gates, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Through the Spanish, moss-draped entrance, she could see the mansion's imposing silhouette, and parked beneath the portico, a sleek black Mercedes that screamed Manhattan wealth. He was already here. Callista checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, smoothing down her professional blazer and adjusting the silver locket at her throat. She'd chosen her outfit carefully: conservative navy suit, hair pulled back in a neat chignon, minimal makeup, armor disguised as professionalism. She needed every defense she could muster for what lay ahead. The drive through the estate grounds felt eternal, each turn revealing more of the mansion's faded grandeur. Massive live oaks created a canopy overhead, their branches heavy with history and secrets. Like her, Callista thought grimly, beautiful on the surface, but carrying burdens that threatened to topple everything. As she parked beside the Mercedes, her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Delacroix. "Elijah is having breakfast. Such a sweet boy. Don't worry about anything except your work, dear." The message should have been comforting, but instead it twisted the knife of guilt deeper. Elijah had asked why Mama seemed nervous this morning, his amber eyes, his father's eyes, bright with concern. She'd kissed his forehead and told him she was starting an important new project, which was true enough. She simply hadn't mentioned that the project might destroy their carefully constructed world. Callista gathered her portfolio and surveying equipment, taking one last steadying breath. Through the mansion's tall windows, she caught a glimpse of movement, a familiar silhouette that made her pulse stutter. Even after 5 years, her body recognized him instantly. The front door opened before she could knock, and there he was. Bennett Carrington stood framed in the doorway like something from a dream or a nightmare, depending on perspective. Time had been kind to him. If anything, he was more handsome now than she remembered. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his amber eyes held depths that hadn't been there before. He wore a crisp white shirt rolled up at the sleeves and dark slacks that fit him perfectly, every inch the successful CEO she'd read about in business magazines. For a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with tension, unspoken words, and the weight of everything that had been left unsaid 5 years ago. Callista. Her name fell from his lips like a prayer, soft and reverent and tinged with something that might have been regret. "Mr. Carrington." She kept her voice carefully neutral, professional, even as her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. "Thank you for this opportunity." Something flickered across his face, hurt perhaps at the formal address, but he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Please, come in. I've been looking forward to working with you again." Again. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. They'd worked together that night at the gala, minds meeting over architectural theory and historical preservation. But this was different, professional, bounded by contracts and deadlines instead of champagne and starlight. The mansion's foyer was breathtaking, even in its current state of elegant decay. A grand staircase swept upward beneath a crystal chandelier that caught the morning light and scattered it in rainbow fragments across the walls. Faded frescoes decorated the ceiling, telling stories of a more gracious era. "It's magnificent," Callista breathed, momentarily forgetting her careful composure. "The bone structure is still solid, but the detail work." She moved closer to examine the hand-carved moldings, her fingers tracing intricate patterns that spoke of master craftsmen long gone. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Bennett's voice was closer now, and she could smell his cologne, subtle, expensive, achingly familiar. "I knew you'd understand what this place could become." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat 5 years disappeared. She was 26 again, laughing at his stories about demanding clients while they danced to jazz music. His hand had been warm on her back, his eyes full of promises he'd never kept. Callista stepped back abruptly, rebuilding her professional walls. "The restoration will be extensive. 6 months might be optimistic, depending on what we find when we start opening walls." "Budget isn't a concern," Bennett said quietly. "I want it done right, no matter what it takes." She nodded, pulling out her tablet to take notes. But her hands were trembling slightly, and she hoped he didn't notice. Being this close to him, breathing the same air, was torture. Every cell in her body remembered how they'd fit together, how he'd made her feel beautiful and brilliant and worthy of a fairy tale. "The kitchen will need to be completely gutted," she continued, forcing herself to focus on work. "And the plumbing is probably original to the house. Whatever you think is best." There was something in his tone that made her look up, and she found him studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Callista, we should stick to the project," she interrupted, panic fluttering in her chest. She couldn't let him say whatever was building behind those amber eyes, not when she was barely holding herself together. "Professional boundaries are important." Bennett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. "Of course. You're absolutely right." They spent the next 2 hours surveying the mansion room by room, their conversation carefully confined to architectural assessments and restoration timelines. But the awareness never left, the way his presence seemed to fill every space, how her skin tingled when he accidentally brushed her hand while pointing out structural details, the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. As they concluded in the library, surrounded by empty bookshelves and dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight, Callista packed her equipment with businesslike efficiency. "I'll have a preliminary report to you by Friday," she said, not meeting his eyes, "including timeline estimates and material costs." Callista, the way he said her name, stopped her in her tracks. "Are we really going to pretend we're strangers?" She turned slowly, her heart hammering. "We are strangers, Mr. Carrington. One night 5 years ago doesn't change that, doesn't it?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes. "Because I remember everything about that night, every conversation, every laugh, every moment, and I've regretted walking away from it every day since." The confession hit her like a physical blow. All the carefully constructed walls she'd built came crashing down, leaving her raw and exposed. For a wild moment, she almost told him everything, about the pregnancy test, about the lonely nights, wondering if she'd made the right choice, about the little boy who had his eyes and his stubborn chin. Instead, she stepped back, clutching her portfolio like a shield. "That was a long time ago. We're different people now." Bennett's face shuttered, the vulnerability disappearing behind executive composure. "You're right, of course, I apologize for overstepping." Callista nodded shakily and fled, her heels clicking against marble floors that had witnessed a century of secrets. Only when she was safely in her car did she allow the tears to fall, hot and bitter against her cheeks. The hardest part wasn't seeing him again. It was remembering how much she'd never stopped loving him. Callista's hands were still shaking when she pulled into her driveway that evening, The modest Victorian cottage she called home had never looked more precious, its cheerful yellow paint and white picket fence a stark contrast to the Beaumont estate's imposing grandeur. This was her sanctuary, the place where she and Elijah had built their life together, safe from the complications of her past. But as she sat in her car, watching the warm light spill from the kitchen windows, that safety felt more fragile than ever. "Mama!" Elijah burst through the front door before she could even gather her things, his small body launching into her arms with the fearless enthusiasm that characterized everything he did. "Mrs. Delacroix taught me how to make beignets. Well, I mostly watched, but I got to sprinkle the powdered sugar." Callista buried her face in his dark hair, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood, playground dust, vanilla extract, and that indefinable smell that was purely him, her anchor, her reason for everything. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." She managed to keep her voice steady, though her heart was still raw from the afternoon's encounter. "Did you thank Mrs. Delacroix?" "Of course. I'm not a barbarian." Elijah pulled back with the exaggerated indignation only a 5-year-old could muster, and Callista couldn't help but smile. He'd picked up the word barbarian from one of his library books and used it whenever he wanted to sound grown up. Mrs. Delacroix appeared in the doorway, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite a day of entertaining an energetic child. At 73, she was a force of nature disguised as a sweet southern grandmother, and Callista didn't know what she'd do without her. "That boy of yours has been an angel," the older woman said, though her sharp eyes were studying Callista's face with concern. "How did your first day go, dear?" "Fine," Callista replied too quickly. "Just a lot to take in. Big project." Mrs. Delacroix's expression suggested she wasn't buying the casual response, but she simply nodded. "Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. And Elijah, you remember what we talked about? Help Mama relax because new jobs are stressful," Elijah recited dutifully, then looked up at Callista with those impossibly familiar amber eyes. "Are you stressed, Mama? You look funny." "Out of the mouths of babes." Callista forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "Just tired, baby. Nothing a good dinner and some cuddle time won't fix." After Mrs. Delacroix left, Callista found herself going through the motions of their evening routine while her mind remained trapped at the Beaumont estate. Dinner was grilled cheese and tomato soup, Elijah's favorite, but she barely tasted it. Her son chattered about his day, about the caterpillar he'd found in the garden, about the book Mrs. Delacroix had read to him, but his voice seemed to come from far away. It wasn't until bath time that Elijah's resemblance to his father hit her like a physical blow. Sitting in the tub, his dark hair slicked back with water, he looked exactly like Bennett had in one of the newspaper photos she'd seen over the years. The same strong jawline, the same thoughtful expression when he was concentrating on something important, in this case, making his rubber duck perform elaborate diving maneuvers. "Mama, why are you crying?" Elijah's voice was small, concerned in the way children become when their world feels suddenly unstable. Callista quickly wiped her eyes, not even realizing the tears had started. "I'm not crying, sweetheart. Just got some soap in my eyes." But Elijah wasn't fooled. He stood up in the tub, water cascading off his small frame, and wrapped his wet arms around her neck. "It's okay to be sad sometimes, Mama. You told me that when I cried about my goldfish going to heaven." The simple wisdom of it broke something inside her chest. Here was this perfect little person, this miracle she'd created and raised alone, trying to comfort her with the very lessons she'd taught him. How could she ever risk losing this? How could she tell him about a father who didn't even know he existed? "You're right, baby," she whispered against his damp hair. "Sometimes grown-ups get sad too. But you know what makes me feel better?" "What?" "Knowing I have the best little boy in the whole world." Elijah giggled, the sound bright and pure in the steamy bathroom. "Even better than Tommy Henderson?" "Especially better than Tommy Henderson." Later, after Elijah was tucked into bed with his favorite stuffed dinosaur and a promise that she'd check on him before she went to sleep, Callista sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. The preliminary report for the Beaumont estate stared back at her from her laptop screen, cursor blinking accusingly in the middle of an unfinished sentence. She'd been trying to work for 2 hours, but every time she attempted to focus on structural assessments and renovation timelines, her mind wandered back to the way Bennett had looked at her, the regret in his voice when he'd said he'd thought about their night together every day, the hurt that had flashed across his face when she'd called him Mr. Carrington. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the sender, Bennett Carrington. I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable today. That wasn't my intention. I'd like to keep things strictly professional moving forward. BC Callista stared at the message for a long time, her emotions warring between relief and something that felt suspiciously like disappointment. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? Professional boundaries, no complications, no risk of him discovering the truth about Elijah. But as she typed back a carefully neutral response, agreed. See you tomorrow for the structural assessment. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake, that by keeping him at arm's length, she was protecting herself from the very thing she'd always secretly hoped for. The sound of small feet on hardwood floors interrupted her brooding. Elijah appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching his dinosaur and rubbing his eyes. "Mama, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about my daddy." Callista's blood turned to ice. "What about your daddy, sweetheart?" Elijah padded over and climbed into her lap, his warm weight both comforting and terrifying. "I was wondering if he's sad too, like you were today. Mrs. Henderson says daddies get sad when they can't see their little boys." Oh, God. Callista's throat constricted as she struggled to find words that wouldn't be lies, but wouldn't destroy them both either. They'd had versions of this conversation before, but never when her own emotions were so raw, so close to the surface. "Some daddies do get sad about that," she said carefully, "but remember what we talked about. Sometimes people can't be together even when they care about each other. It doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong." Elijah was quiet for a moment, his small fingers tracing patterns on her arm. "Do you think my daddy would like me if he met me?" The question hit her like a knife to the chest. If Bennett knew about Elijah, about this brilliant, funny, sweet little boy who had his eyes and his stubborn chin, would he love him instantly the way she had? Or would he see only a complication, an unwanted responsibility that disrupted his carefully ordered life? "Any daddy would be lucky to have you, baby," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "You're the most amazing little boy in the world, even if I sometimes forget to put my toys away. Even then." As she carried Elijah back to bed and tucked him in again, Callista made a silent promise. Whatever happened with Bennett, whatever complications arose from working together, she would protect her son above all else. Elijah would never know the rejection she'd felt that morning 5 years ago when Bennett had handed her his business card like an afterthought. But as she returned to her lonely kitchen and the unfinished report, one question echoed in her mind. What if she was wrong? What if Bennett wasn't the man she remembered? What if he'd grown, changed, become someone who could love them both? The possibility was too dangerous to entertain, wasn't it? The next morning brought unexpected complications in the form of a thunderstorm that rolled in from the Atlantic just as Callista arrived at the Beaumont estate. Rain lashed against the mansion's tall windows, and lightning illuminated the Spanish moss in stark, dramatic silhouettes. The weather seemed to mirror her internal turmoil, beautiful but dangerous, charged with electricity that threatened to destroy everything in its path. Bennett was waiting in the grand foyer when she entered, shaking raindrops from her jacket. He looked different today, less polished, more human. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and he'd traded his expensive suit for dark jeans and a simple grey sweater that made his amber eyes seem even more intense. "I thought we might need to postpone," he said, gesturing toward the storm raging outside. But then I realized, if we're going to assess the roof and foundation integrity, this is actually perfect timing." Callista nodded, grateful for the professional focus. Water damage will show us exactly where the weak points are. They began their inspection in the basement, armed with flashlights and moisture detectors. The mansion's foundation was solid, massive stones laid by craftsmen who'd built to last, but there were telltale signs of water intrusion in several corners. As they worked, their conversation remained carefully neutral, focused entirely on structural concerns and renovation priorities. But the forced proximity was torture. Every time Bennett leaned close to examine something, Callista caught that familiar scent of his cologne mixed with rain. When he handed her tools, their fingers would brush, sending jolts of electricity through her that had nothing to do with the storm overhead. And worst of all, she kept catching him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "The southeast corner needs significant work," she noted, making careful measurements. "Water's been getting in here for years. How long do you think?" Bennett's voice was closer than expected, and she looked up to find him standing just behind her, studying the same damage. "Hard to say. Maybe 5 years. Could be longer." The irony of the timeline wasn't lost on her. 5 years. Exactly how long she'd been hiding their son's existence. A particularly violent crash of thunder made them both jump, and the lights flickered ominously before going out entirely, plunging them into darkness save for their flashlight beams. "Emergency generator should kick in any minute," Bennett said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. They waited in the basement's humid darkness, their breathing seeming unnaturally loud in the confined space. Callista's flashlight beam danced across the stone walls, creating shifting shadows that felt almost alive. The intimacy of the situation was overwhelming, trapped together in the belly of this crumbling mansion, with nothing but truth and regret hanging between them. "Callista." Bennett's voice was soft, careful. "I know you said we should keep things professional, but I need you to know something." "Please don't." She backed away, her flashlight beam wavering. "Whatever you're going to say, just don't. I never stopped thinking about you." The words tumbled out anyway, raw and honest in the darkness. "That night, it wasn't just some meaningless encounter for me. You have to know that." Callista's breath caught. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. The moment when their carefully constructed professional boundaries would crumble like the mansion's deteriorating foundation. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "Doesn't it?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Because the way you looked at me yesterday, the way you're looking at me now—" "You don't know anything about my life," she interrupted, panic rising in her chest. "About who I am now, what's important to me. 5 years is a long time, Bennett. People change, priorities shift. Then tell me." His voice was urgent now, pleading. "Tell me about your life. Let me understand what I'm missing." For a wild moment, Callista almost did. The words were right there, desperate to be spoken. "I have a son. Our son. A beautiful little boy with your eyes and your stubborn chin, who asks me about his daddy and breaks my heart every single day." Instead, the generator finally roared to life, flooding the basement with harsh fluorescent light that made them both squint and step apart. "We should continue the inspection," Callista said stiffly, the moment shattered by electric illumination. Bennett nodded, but something had shifted between them. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by a tension that felt combustible. They worked in near silence for the next hour, documenting water damage and structural concerns, but Callista was acutely aware of every movement he made, every breath he took. When they finally emerged from the basement, the storm had intensified. Rain pounded against the windows with such force that it sounded like gunfire, and the wind howled through the mansion's many gaps and cracks like a living thing in pain. "I should go," Callista said, gathering her equipment. "This storm's only getting worse." "You can't drive in this." Bennett moved to the window, peering out at the apocalyptic weather. "The roads will be flooded. It's not safe." As if to prove his point, a massive oak branch crashed down in the circular drive, missing her Honda by mere feet. Callista's hands flew to her mouth in shock. "I have to get home," she said, pulling out her phone to call Mrs. Delacroix. "Elijah, my son. He'll be scared of the storm." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she saw Bennett's head snap around, his eyes widening with surprise. "You have a son?" There was something strange in his voice, not quite shock, but something deeper, more complex. Callista's throat went dry. "Yes, he's 5. She watched the calculation happen in Bennett's eyes, saw the exact moment when the timeline clicked into place. His face went completely white, and he gripped the window frame so hard his knuckles stood out in sharp relief. 5 years old, he repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The phone call to Mrs. Delacroix provided a temporary distraction. Elijah was fine, safely tucked away with his adopted grandmother, playing board games and eating cookies while the storm raged outside. But when Callista hung up, Bennett was still staring at her with that shell-shocked expression. "What's his name?" The question was so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the storm. Elijah. The name fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Bennett closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "My middle name is Elijah. It was my grandfather's name." The confession hit Callista like a physical blow. She'd chosen the name because she'd loved the sound of it, the strength it represented. She'd never known about the family connection, but somehow, on some subconscious level, she'd given their son a piece of his father's heritage. "Bennett, is he mine?" The question cut through her attempt at explanation like a blade, direct, devastating, undeniable. Callista looked at this man she'd loved and lost and found again, at the pain and hope warring in his amber eyes, and felt her carefully constructed world begin to crumble around her. Outside, thunder crashed like the sound of foundations splitting apart, and Callista realized that some storms were too powerful to weather alone. The truth was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The silence that followed Bennett's question stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the relentless drumming of rain against the mansion's windows. Callista stood frozen in the grand foyer, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it over the storm. "Is he mine?" 3 simple words that demanded an answer she'd spent 5 years preparing for, and yet was completely unprepared to give. Bennett's face had gone pale, his amber eyes searching her expression with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see straight through to her soul. His hands were clenched at his sides, and she could see the slight tremor running through them, the only sign that beneath his controlled exterior he was falling apart. Callista. Her name was a whisper, a prayer, a plea. "Please, I need to know." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the words tangling in her throat like thorns. How did you tell someone they had a child? How did you explain 5 years of silence, of secrets, of choices made in fear and desperation? Yes. The word escaped as barely more than a breath, but it hit the space between them like a thunderclap. Bennett staggered backward as if she'd physically struck him, his hand reaching out to brace against the marble staircase. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking almost ghostly in the mansion's electric lighting. "Yes," he repeated slowly, testing the weight of the word. "I have a son." "Bennett, 5 years." His voice was raw, broken. 5 years, Callista. 5 years I've had a child and didn't know." He looked up at her then, and the pain in his eyes was so acute she had to fight not to look away. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" The question she'd dreaded most. Callista wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the Georgia humidity. "You handed me your business card and walked away. What was I supposed to think?" "You could have called. You could have—" "I did call!" The words burst out of her with surprising vehemence. "I called your office 2 months later, when I found out I was pregnant. But when your assistant asked what it was regarding, I couldn't find the words. How was I supposed to explain that I was some nobody who'd spent one night with Bennett Carrington and was now carrying his child?" Bennett's expression crumbled. "God, Callista, I'm so sorry. I never meant—" That morning, The conference call, the way I handled everything. It was the biggest mistake of my life. It doesn't matter now. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It mattered more than anything. It had shaped every decision she'd made since. Of course it matters. Bennett pushed off from the staircase, moving toward her with desperate energy. I have a son I've never met, a child who doesn't know I exist. How can you say it doesn't matter? Because you have a life. Callista's voice cracked with emotion. A successful company, a world that revolves around board meetings and corporate acquisitions. What place would we have had in that? What place would Elijah have had? That's not your decision to make. The words came out harder than he'd probably intended, and she saw him visibly try to rein in his emotions. He's my son too. I had a right to know. Did you? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Because 5 years ago, you were a stranger who forgot my name the minute you got a business call. How was I supposed to trust you with the most precious thing in my life? Bennett ran his hands through his hair, the perfect composure she'd always associated with him completely shattered. What's he like? The question was so quiet, so vulnerable, that it broke her heart all over again. Callista felt tears she'd been holding back for 5 years finally start to fall. He's wonderful, curious and funny, and so smart it scares me sometimes. He asks a million questions about everything, and he has this laugh that just lights up whatever room he's in. He loves dinosaurs and building blocks and story time before bed. Does he look like me? Bennett's voice was thick with emotion. God, yes. The admission felt like tearing open a wound. He has your eyes, your stubborn chin. Sometimes when he's concentrating on something, he gets this little wrinkle between his eyebrows just like you do. And he's determined. When he sets his mind on something, there's no changing it. Bennett closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, tears were streaming down his face. I've missed everything. His first steps, his first words, 5 birthdays. His birthday is next week, Callista whispered. July 12th. The date hit Bennett like another blow. He sank onto the mansion's ornate settee, burying his face in his hands. I should have been there, for all of it. I should have been the father he deserved. You didn't know because you didn't tell me. The words exploded out of him, and then immediately he looked stricken. I'm sorry, this isn't your fault, not entirely. But Callista, how could you keep him from me? How could you make that choice? Because I was terrified. The confession tore from her throat. Terrified that you'd reject us both, or worse, that you'd try to take him away from me. I was 26 years old, pregnant and alone, working 2 jobs just to get by. You were this powerful, successful man who could afford armies of lawyers. What if you'd decided I wasn't good enough to raise your child? I would never... Wouldn't you? Callista's voice was steady now, steel beneath the sadness. Can you honestly tell me that 5 years ago, if some woman you barely knew had shown up claiming to be pregnant with your child, you wouldn't have questioned her motives, wouldn't have wondered if she was after your money? Bennett opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again, because she was right, and they both knew it. 5 years ago, he'd been different, colder, more cynical, more suspicious of people's intentions. I want to meet him, he said finally. Please. I know I have no right to ask, but he's my son. I want to know him. The request she'd been dreading. Callista thought of Elijah, sweet and innocent and trusting, who still asked questions about his daddy late at night. How could she explain that his father had been here all along, that she'd kept them apart? He doesn't know about you, she said quietly. He asks sometimes, but I've always told him that sometimes people can't be together even when they care about each other. What will you tell him now? Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant. But inside the mansion, Callista felt like she was standing in the eye of a hurricane that was about to make landfall. I don't know, she admitted. I honestly don't know. Bennett stood slowly, crossing to where she stood by the window. He stopped just out of reach, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes, the same flecks she saw every day in their son. Let me try, he said softly. "Let me try to be the father I should have been from the beginning. I know I can't make up for the lost time, but maybe we can figure out how to move forward." Callista looked at this man who'd once broken her heart and was now asking for a chance to be part of their son's life. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about disrupting their peaceful existence, about the complications this would bring. But the part of her that remembered how it felt to be loved by him, even briefly, whispered that maybe some risks were worth taking. "One meeting," she heard herself saying, "one chance to meet him. But if you hurt him, Bennett, if you disappoint him or make promises you can't keep, I will never forgive you." Bennett nodded solemnly. "I understand. And Callista, thank you for giving me this chance, for giving him life, for being strong enough to do what I was too much of a coward to stay and fight for." As the storm finally began to clear outside, Callista realized that the most dangerous weather was just beginning. 3 days later, Callista stood at her kitchen window, watching Elijah chase fireflies in their backyard as the summer sun painted the sky in shades of coral and gold. Her hands trembled as she gripped her coffee mug, the liquid long since gone cold. In less than an hour, Bennett would be here. In less than an hour, her carefully constructed world would change forever. She'd spent those 3 days in a state of controlled panic, rehearsing conversations that seemed impossible, trying to find words to explain the unexplainable to a 5-year-old boy. How did you tell a child that the father he'd wondered about his entire life was coming to dinner? How did you prepare him for the possibility that everything might change? "Mama, you're doing that worry face again," Elijah observed, appearing at her elbow with grass stains on his knees and a mason jar full of lightning bugs. "Mrs. Delacroix says worry lines make people look older." Callista managed a smile, smoothing down his unruly dark hair. "Just thinking about our dinner guest tonight, sweetheart? The important businessman?" Elijah's amber eyes, so achingly familiar, sparkled with curiosity. "Is he nice? Will he like my dinosaur collection?" The questions hit her like physical blows. She'd told Elijah that someone special was coming to visit, someone she'd known a long time ago who wanted to meet him. The simplification felt like another lie added to the mountain she'd already built. "I think he'll love your dinosaurs," she said, and that at least was true. Bennett had always been fascinated by history, by things that had endured through time. "But remember what we talked about? Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings, so if anyone seems sad or overwhelmed, it's not because of anything you did." Elijah nodded solemnly, though she could see he didn't fully understand. How could he? At 5, his world was still beautifully simple. Love was unconditional. Families came in all shapes. And the most important thing was whether someone would play trucks with you in the sandbox. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, and Callista's heart nearly stopped. Bennett had always been punctual, she remembered, another small detail that felt monumentally significant now. "He's here!" Elijah bounced on his toes, firefly jar clutched to his chest. "Can I answer the door, please?" "Let Mama answer first, then you can say hello," Callista said, her voice steadier than she felt. She opened the door to find Bennett standing on her front porch, and her breath caught. He looked different than he had at the mansion, softer somehow, more human. He'd traded his usual expensive attire for dark jeans and a simple blue button-down that made his eyes look almost navy in the porch light. In his hands were 2 wrapped gifts and what appeared to be a bottle of wine. "Hi," he said quietly, and she could hear the nervousness beneath his calm exterior. "Hi, yourself." She stepped aside to let him in, acutely aware of how small and modest her home must seem to him. "Come in. He's very excited to meet you." Bennett crossed the threshold into her world, his eyes taking in the cheerful chaos of a home shared with a 5-year-old, art projects on the refrigerator, books scattered across the coffee table, a forgotten stuffed animal by the door. His gaze lingered on a framed photo on the entry table, Callista and Elijah at the beach last summer, both laughing as a wave crashed over their feet. "Is that him?" Bennett's voice was barely above a whisper. Before Callista could answer, Elijah appeared in the hallway, firefly jar still in hand, his face bright with curiosity and welcome. "Hello," he said, with the fearless friendliness that characterized everything he did. "I'm Elijah. Mama says you're someone very special." Bennett went completely still, and Callista watched as 5 years of wondering, of imagining, collided with reality. His son, their son, stood before him in grass-stained shorts and a T-shirt with a grinning T-Rex, his dark hair askew and his amber eyes bright with innocent trust. "Hello, Elijah." Bennett's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. "I'm Bennett. Your mama's right. You are someone very special." Elijah beamed at the compliment, stepping closer with the confidence of a child who'd never known rejection. "Do you want to see my fireflies? I caught 12 of them, but I'm going to let them go after dinner because Mama says they have families to get back to." The simple statement hit Bennett like a physical blow, and Callista saw his eyes fill with tears he was fighting to hold back. Families. The word carried so much weight, so much pain and possibility. "I would love to see your fireflies," Bennett managed, crouching down to Elijah's level. As her son chattered excitedly about his capture techniques and the different patterns of light the insects made, Callista watched Bennett's face transform. The guarded expression she'd grown used to melted away, replaced by wonder, love, and an ache so profound it was almost physical to witness. "They're beautiful," Bennett said when Elijah finished his explanation. "You're very good at taking care of them. Mama taught me. She says everything deserves to be treated with kindness, even bugs." Elijah tilted his head, studying Bennett with the intensity only children possessed. "You have the same eyes as me. Mama, did you notice? His eyes are the same color." Callista's throat constricted. Trust Elijah to notice immediately what she'd been dreading him to see. But her son's observation was matter of fact, curious rather than suspicious. "I did notice that," she said carefully. "Some people just have similar features." Bennett looked up at her over Elijah's head, and the gratitude in his expression was overwhelming. He understood what she was doing, giving him time, letting this happen naturally rather than overwhelming their son with life-changing revelations. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Elijah asked Bennett suddenly. "We're having spaghetti and meatballs, and Mama makes the best meatballs in all of Georgia, maybe even all of America." "I would be honored," Bennett replied solemnly, as if he'd just been invited to dine with royalty. As they moved toward the kitchen, Elijah's small hand slipping trustingly into Bennett's larger one, Callista felt something shift inside her chest. This was what she'd been afraid of for 5 years, this moment when her son would connect with his father, when the careful boundaries she'd built would start to crumble. But watching Bennett's face as Elijah chattered about his day, seeing the wonder and love that transformed his features, she realized that maybe some walls were meant to come down. Maybe some risks were worth the potential for something beautiful. During dinner, Elijah regaled Bennett with stories about his adventures, the caterpillar he'd rescued, the fort he'd built in the backyard, his plans to become a paleontologist or maybe a superhero. He hadn't decided yet. Bennett listened with the attention he usually reserved for board meetings, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at Elijah's jokes with genuine delight. "You're a really good listener," Elijah observed, twirling spaghetti on his fork with the serious concentration of a 5-year-old. "Most grown-ups interrupt a lot, but you let me finish my whole stories." "Your stories are worth listening to," Bennett replied, and Callista could hear the emotion underlying his words. As the evening wound down and Elijah's bedtime approached, her son surprised them both by sliding off his chair and walking over to Bennett. "Will you come back and visit again?" he asked with the directness that only children possessed. "I have more dinosaurs to show you, and Mama said she might teach me to make cookies this weekend." Bennett looked at Callista, a question in his eyes that went far beyond weekend visits. She nodded slightly, and relief flooded his features. "I would like that very much," he told Elijah, "if it's okay with your mama." "It's okay," Elijah declared with 5-year-old authority. "Right, Mama?" "Right," Callista whispered. and meant it. As she tucked Elijah into bed later, he was practically vibrating with excitement. "I really like Bennett, Mama. He's kind and he has good manners, and he didn't think my dinosaur facts were boring. Do you think he likes me too?" "I think he likes you very much, sweetheart." Elijah was quiet for a moment, then, "He seems a little sad, though, like he's missing something important." Out of the mouths of babes. Callista kissed her son's forehead, marveling once again at his intuitive understanding of the world around him. "Sometimes grown-ups carry sadness about things that happened a long time ago," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean they can't be happy too." When she returned to the living room, Bennett was standing by the window, looking out at the garden where Elijah had released his fireflies. The tiny lights danced among the flowers like earthbound stars. "Thank you," he said without turning around, "for tonight, for letting me meet him, for giving me something I didn't even know I was missing." Callista joined him at the window, watching the fireflies dance. "He's an amazing kid. He's perfect." Bennett's voice was thick with emotion. "And he's ours." The possessive pronoun hung between them, full of possibility and complication in equal measure. Callista had spent 5 years thinking of Elijah as hers alone. Learning to share him, to think in terms of ours, would be the hardest thing she'd ever done. But maybe, just maybe, it would also be the most worthwhile. Over the next 2 weeks, Bennett became a fixture in their lives with a naturalness that both thrilled and terrified Callista. He showed up every evening after work, still in his expensive suits, but with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, ready to hear about Elijah's latest adventures. And their son, their son, had embraced this new presence with the wholehearted enthusiasm he brought to everything. "Bennett! Bennett!" Elijah would shout, racing across the yard the moment Bennett's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. "Guess what I learned today?" And Bennett would crouch down, giving Elijah his complete attention, as if nothing in the world mattered more than hearing about the butterfly life cycle or the proper way to build a blanket fort. Callista would watch from the kitchen window, her heart doing complicated gymnastics as she witnessed the bond growing stronger each day. It should have been perfect. This was what she'd secretly dreamed of during all those lonely nights. Elijah having a father, someone to share the burden and joy of raising this remarkable little person. But alongside the happiness came a gnawing fear that she couldn't quite shake. Bennett was good with Elijah, better than good. He was patient and kind, answering endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether dinosaurs had belly buttons. He brought thoughtful gifts, educational books about archaeology, a small telescope for stargazing, art supplies for Elijah's creative projects. He never missed a good night story, never seemed impatient with the elaborate rituals of bedtime. But sometimes, when she caught him looking at Elijah with that expression of wonder mixed with grief, Callista remembered that this wasn't just about them anymore. Bennett had his own life, his own world in New York that he'd eventually return to. What happened then? "Mama, are you listening?" Elijah's voice pulled her from her brooding. They were sitting at the kitchen table, Elijah working on a drawing while she attempted to focus on project reports. "Sorry, sweetheart. What did you say?" "I asked if Bennett can come to my birthday party next week." Elijah looked up from his artwork. A picture of 3 stick figures under a rainbow labeled "Me, Mama," and Bennett in his careful kindergarten handwriting. "Mrs. Henderson is bringing her chocolate cake, and we're going to have games in the backyard." Callista's chest tightened. Elijah's birthday, the day that would mark 6 years since the night that changed everything. She'd been dreading it for weeks, knowing that Bennett would want to be there, knowing that it would feel like some kind of milestone in this complicated new arrangement they were building. "I'm sure he'd love to come," she said carefully. "But remember, sweetheart, Bennett has a very important job. Sometimes he might not be able to..." But he said he'd never miss anything important again. Elijah's voice carried the absolute faith of childhood. "And birthdays are super important, right?" The words hit Callista like a physical blow. When had Bennett said that? And more importantly, what did he mean by again? The implication hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all the moments he'd already missed. That evening, after Elijah was in bed, Callista found Bennett sitting on the front porch swing, staring out at the fireflies dancing in her garden. The June night was warm and humid, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder that promised another storm. "He wants you at his party," she said, settling beside him on the swing. The space felt both intimate and safe, close enough to talk quietly, but public enough to maintain the careful boundaries they'd established. "You wouldn't miss it." Bennett's voice was quiet but firm. "If that's okay with you." Callista nodded, though something in his tone made her uneasy. "Bennett, what did you mean when you told him you'd never miss anything important again?" Bennett was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I missed his first word, his first steps. 5 birthdays, 5 Christmases, every milestone that mattered. I can't get those back, but I can make sure I don't miss any more." "Your life is in New York," Callista said gently. "The Beaumont project won't last forever. What happens when it's finished?" Bennett turned to look at her, and in the porch light his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've been thinking about that, a lot, actually. And I want to be his father, Callista. Really be his father, not just someone who visits on weekends and holidays. I want to be here for scraped knees and school plays and homework help. I want to teach him to drive and give him terrible advice about girls and embarrass him at graduation." The longing in his voice broke her heart, but practical concerns crowded her mind. "You can't just uproot your entire life, your business, your responsibilities." "I can move the company," Bennett said quietly, "or at least a significant portion of it. Savannah's growing. There are opportunities here. I've already started looking into it." Callista's breath caught. "You're thinking of moving here permanently?" "I'm thinking of building a life here, with you. With Elijah." Bennett reached for her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from their work at the mansion. "I know we have a lot to figure out, a lot of history to work through, but Callista, what we had that night, it wasn't just physical attraction or temporary infatuation, at least not for me. No, Bennett, I love him," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I love our son in a way I didn't know was possible. And he paused, seeming to gather courage. "I never stopped loving you." The confession hung between them like a bridge, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to ignore. Callista felt tears prick her eyes as 5 years of carefully guarded hopes threatened to overwhelm her. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "We can't just pick up where we left off. Too much has happened, too much has changed." "I'm not asking to pick up where we left off," Bennett said. "I'm asking to start over, to build something new, something real, to be the man you and Elijah deserve." Before Callista could respond, the screen door creaked open behind them, and Elijah appeared in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mama, I had a scary dream." He padded over to the swing, climbing into Callista's lap with the automatic trust of a child who'd never doubted he was safe and loved. "What kind of scary dream, buddy?" Bennett asked softly, and Callista felt her heart clench at how natural the endearment sounded. "I dreamed that you went away and didn't come back," Elijah mumbled against Callista's shoulder, "like my goldfish did when he went to heaven." Callista and Bennett exchanged a look over their son's head, both understanding the weight of his words. In his simple, 5-year-old way, Elijah was expressing the same fear that kept Callista awake at night, that this happiness was temporary, that Bennett would eventually return to his old life and leave them behind. "I'm not going anywhere, Elijah," Bennett said, his voice gentle but firm. "I promise. Really. Even when your work is finished? Even then. I'm going to stay right here in Savannah, close to you and your mama." Elijah lifted his head, studying Bennett with those 2 wise amber eyes. "Because we're family now?" The question was innocent, matter of fact, but it hit both adults with the force of a revelation. Family. Not just biological connection, but chosen love, daily commitment, the decision to build something together. "Yes," Bennett said, his voice thick with emotion, "because we're family now." Elijah smiled sleepily and settled back against Callista's chest, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Good. Families should stay together. As Callista carried their drowsy son back to bed, she felt something shift inside her chest. For 5 years, she'd been protecting Elijah from the possibility of disappointment. But watching Bennett with him, seeing the genuine love and commitment in his eyes, she realized that maybe the biggest risk wasn't opening their hearts to him. Maybe the biggest risk was keeping them closed. When she returned to the porch, Bennett was still sitting on the swing, staring up at the star-scattered sky. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you said to him about staying. I meant every word." Bennett looked at her, his expression serious. "I know I have a lot to prove, a lot of trust to rebuild, but I'm not going anywhere, Callista. This is where I belong." As another distant rumble of thunder rolled across the Georgia night, Callista realized that some storms brought destruction, but others brought renewal. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out which kind this would be. July 12th dawned bright and clear, with the kind of golden Georgia sunshine that made everything look like it had been touched by magic. Callista stood in her kitchen at 6 a.m., already dressed and anxious, watching steam rise from her coffee mug while her mind raced through the day's possibilities. Elijah's 6th birthday. The first birthday Bennett would share with his son. The day that might change everything. In a few hours, their backyard would be filled with neighborhood children, parents, and the carefully orchestrated chaos of a 6-year-old's birthday party. Mrs. Delacroix had outdone herself with decorations, dinosaur-themed everything, just as Elijah had requested. Mrs. Henderson's legendary chocolate cake sat waiting in the refrigerator, complete with 6 candles and a plastic T-Rex on top. But beneath the party preparations, Callista carried a weight that had nothing to do with streamers and party favors. Today felt like a reckoning, the culmination of 6 years of secrets and choices that had led them to this moment. "Mama!" Elijah's voice rang out from upstairs, vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Is it time for my party yet? Are people coming soon?" "Not for a few hours yet, birthday boy," Callista called back, smiling despite her nerves. "Come down and have breakfast first." Elijah thundered down the stairs in his dinosaur pajamas, his dark hair sticking up in every direction and his amber eyes bright with anticipation. At 6, he was all knees and elbows and boundless energy, but Callista could see hints of the man he'd become. Bennett's determined chin, his thoughtful way of tilting his head when he was considering something important. "Will Bennett be here soon?" Elijah asked, climbing into his chair at the kitchen table. "He promised he'd help me set up the dinosaur dig in the sandbox." "He'll be here," Callista assured him, though her stomach twisted with a familiar anxiety. What if something came up? What if Bennett's old world called him back just when Elijah needed him most? But at exactly 9 o'clock, she heard the familiar sound of Bennett's Mercedes in the driveway, followed by Elijah's whoop of joy as he raced to the front door. "Bennett, Bennett, it's my birthday. I'm 6 whole years old now." Callista followed more slowly, her heart doing its usual complicated dance at the sight of Bennett crouched down to Elijah's level, listening with complete attention as their son chattered about his birthday plans. He looked different today, more relaxed, wearing jeans, and a simple blue polo that made his eyes look almost navy. In his hands was a large, carefully wrapped box that immediately captured Elijah's attention. "Is that for me? Can I open it now, please?" Bennett laughed, the sound rich and warm. "After breakfast, birthday boy, but I think you're going to like it." The morning flew by in a blur of party preparations and mounting excitement. Bennett threw himself into the setup with the enthusiasm of a man who'd never had the chance to plan a child's birthday party before. He helped Elijah create an elaborate archaeological dig in the sandbox, burying plastic dinosaur bones for the other children to discover. He hung streamers and inflated balloons, all while fielding a constant stream of questions and observations from their son. Watching them together, Callista felt her carefully constructed walls continuing to crumble. This was what she'd always dreamed of for Elijah, a father who was present, engaged, who found joy in the simple magic of childhood. But it was also what terrified her most, because it was real now, no longer just a fantasy she could control. By noon, the backyard was filled with 6-year-olds and their parents, the air alive with laughter and the excited chatter of children discovering buried treasure in the sandbox. Elijah was in his element, directing the archaeological expedition with the serious authority of someone who'd been studying dinosaurs since he could walk. "Look what I found!" one little girl shrieked, holding up a plastic triceratops skull. "It's a whole head!" Bennett knelt beside her, examining the find with scientific solemnity. "Excellent work, Dr. Sophie. This appears to be from the late Cretaceous period. Very rare indeed." Callista watched from the porch, her heart swelling as she observed Bennett winning over not just the children, but their parents as well. He was charming without being fake, interested without being condescending, and somehow he made every child feel like their discoveries were the most important thing in the world. "He's wonderful with them," Mrs. Delacroix observed, settling beside Callista with a glass of sweet tea. "Natural father, that one." The words hit closer to home than the older woman could know. "Yes, he is. Elijah's lucky to have him in his life." Mrs. Delacroix's sharp eyes studied Callista's face. "And so are you, I think." Before Callista could respond, Elijah's voice rose above the party chatter. "Time for presents, and cake, and singing." The gift-opening ceremony was a delirious affair, with Elijah tearing through wrapping paper with the single-minded focus of a child on his birthday. But when he reached Bennett's carefully wrapped box, something shifted. He handled it more gently, as if he sensed its importance. Inside was a child-sized archaeologist's kit, real tools, a brush set, a magnifying glass, and a leather journal for recording discoveries. But nestled at the bottom was something else, a small, leather-bound photo album. "What's this?" Elijah asked, lifting it out with careful hands. Bennett's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. "Pictures of when your mama was little, and some of me when I was your age. I thought you might like to see where you came from." Elijah opened the album with reverent attention, and Callista felt her breath catch as she realized what Bennett had done. Somehow, he'd gathered photos of both their childhoods, creating a family history that connected their son to both sides of his heritage. "This is Mama!" Elijah exclaimed, pointing to a picture of Callista at age 6, missing her 2 front teeth and grinning at the camera. "She looks just like me." "And this," Bennett said softly, turning the page, "is me at your age." The resemblance was unmistakable. 6-year-old Bennett stared back from the photograph with the same amber eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same mischievous smile that Elijah wore now. The children at the party gathered around, exclaiming over the similarities, but Callista barely heard them over the rushing in her ears. "We look exactly the same," Elijah breathed, comparing his face to the photograph. "We have the same eyes and everything." And then, with the devastating intuition that only children possessed, he looked up at Bennett with a question that would change everything. "Are you my daddy?" The backyard fell silent. Parents stopped their conversations. Children paused in their play, and Callista felt the world tilt on its axis. This was the moment she'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, the truth that could no longer be hidden behind careful explanations and gentle deflections. Bennett's eyes found hers across the suddenly silent yard, asking permission, seeking guidance. She saw her own fear reflected there, but also hope and love and a desperate desire to finally tell their son the truth. Callista nodded, barely perceptibly, and watched as Bennett turned back to Elijah, with tears streaming down his face. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'm your daddy. I've been your daddy since the day you were born, even though I didn't know about you until recently." Elijah stared at him for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. Then his face broke into the most radiant smile Callista had ever seen. "I knew it," he exclaimed, launching himself into Bennett's arms. "I knew you were special. I knew you were supposed to be here." As father and son held each other for the first time with full knowledge of who they were to each other, Callista felt the last of her walls crumble. The truth was out now in the most perfect way possible, not through adult explanations or careful revelations, but through a child's innocent observation and a father's honest answer. The other parents began to understand what they'd witnessed, and a warm murmur of congratulations and surprise rippled through the gathering. But Callista only had eyes for Bennett and Elijah, finally free to be exactly what they'd always been meant to be, father and son. "Does this mean you're going to live with us now?" Elijah asked, pulling back to study Bennett's face with serious consideration. Bennett looked over Elijah's head at Callista, his eyes bright with hope and love and possibility. "Would you like that?" "More than anything in the whole world," Elijah declared. "Right, Mama?" And looking at them together, her son in his father's arms, both of them looking at her with identical expressions of hope, Callista realized that some truths were too powerful to fight. "Right," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The birthday party continued around them, but everything had changed. They were no longer three separate people trying to figure out how to fit together. They were finally, truly, a family. 6 months later, Callista stood in the doorway of what had once been the Beaumont Estate's grand ballroom, watching golden afternoon light stream through the newly restored windows. The mansion was magnificent now, every detail lovingly brought back to life, from the hand-carved moldings to the crystal chandelier that caught the light and scattered rainbows across the polished hardwood floors. It was everything she'd envisioned when they'd first walked through its crumbling corridors. But it wasn't the restoration that made her chest tight with emotion. It was the scene unfolding in the middle of the room. Bennett sat cross-legged on the floor, still in his work clothes, but with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, helping Elijah build an elaborate castle out of wooden blocks. Their son, 6 years old now and more confident every day, was directing the construction with the serious authority of a master architect. "The tower needs to be taller, Daddy," Elijah declared, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on balancing another block. "And we need a bridge for the dinosaurs to cross." "You're absolutely right," Bennett agreed solemnly, reaching for more blocks. "Every good castle needs a dinosaur bridge." The easy affection between them never failed to take Callista's breath away. In the months since that birthday revelation, they'd grown into their relationship with a naturalness that still surprised her. Bennett had kept every promise he'd made, moving his business operations to Savannah, buying a house just down the street from theirs, becoming the kind of father who never missed a bedtime story or a school event. "Mama?" Elijah spotted her in the doorway and waved enthusiastically. "Come see our castle. Daddy says we can have a picnic in here when it's finished." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, entering the ballroom that held so many memories. This was where she and Bennett had danced that first night 6 years ago, where their love story had begun without either of them knowing it would lead to this moment. Bennett looked up at her approach, and the love in his amber eyes still had the power to make her heart skip. "How did the final inspection go?" "Perfect," Callista replied, settling beside them on the floor. "The Historical Society is thrilled. You've created something truly special here." It was true. The Beaumont Estate had been transformed into a luxury hotel and event space, but one that honored its history while embracing the future. It would bring jobs to Savannah, draw visitors from around the world, and stand as a testament to what was possible when you believed in restoration rather than demolition. "We created something special," Bennett corrected gently. "This project brought us together. In a way, this place gave us our family." Elijah abandoned his castle construction to climb into Callista's lap, his small body warm and solid against hers. "Are you gonna live here when it opens, Daddy? 'Cause it's really big and fancy." Bennett chuckled, reaching over to ruffle their son's hair. "No, buddy, this place is beautiful, but it's not home. Home is wherever you and Mama are." The simple statement hit Callista with unexpected force. Home. For so long, she'd thought of home as the small yellow cottage where she and Elijah had built their life together. But sitting here in this grand ballroom with both her boys, she realized that home wasn't a place. It was this feeling of completeness, of belonging, of being exactly where you were meant to be. "Speaking of home," Bennett said, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement that made Callista look at him more closely. "I have something I want to ask you both." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Callista's breath caught in her throat. Elijah perked up with interest, clearly sensing that something important was happening. "Callista," Bennett began, his voice thick with emotion, "6 years ago, you gave me the most precious gift imaginable, even though I was too much of a fool to realize it at the time. You gave me our son, and through him, you gave me a chance to become the man I always wanted to be." Tears were already streaming down Callista's face, but Bennett continued, his words steady and sure. "I know we've been taking things slowly, building trust, figuring out how to be a family, but I can't imagine my life without both of you in it. I don't want to waste another day not being officially completely yours." He opened the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away, an elegant solitaire that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire. But it was his next words that truly undid her. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and Elijah the way you both deserve? Will you make us a real family?" "We're already a real family, Daddy," Elijah piped up with 6-year-old wisdom, making both adults laugh through their tears. "But I think Mama should say yes anyway, 'cause then we can have a big party and Mrs. Delacroix can make one of her special cakes." Callista looked at this man who'd broken her heart and then healed it more completely than she'd ever thought possible. He'd proven himself over and over, not just as a father to Elijah, but as a partner to her. He'd been patient with her fears, understanding of her need to protect their son, supportive of her dreams and ambitions. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Bennett, yes to all of it." Odesse, the ring, slipped onto her finger like it had always belonged there, and then Bennett was kissing her, while Elijah cheered and clapped his hands. When they finally broke apart, their son threw his arms around both of them. "This is the best day ever," Elijah declared, "even better than my birthday." As they sat together in the restored ballroom, surrounded by the golden light of a Georgia afternoon, Callista marveled at the journey that had brought them here. She'd hidden her pregnancy out of fear, built walls around her heart to protect it from more pain. But love, real, deep, transformative love, had a way of breaking down even the strongest barriers. "I love you," she murmured against Bennett's ear. "Both of you. My whole world." "And we love you," Bennett replied, gathering both her and Elijah closer. "Forever and always." Outside, Spanish moss swayed in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. The Beaumont estate stood restored and beautiful around them, but it was just a building, impressive and historically significant, but not what mattered most. What mattered was this: a family that had found its way back to each other against all odds. A love that had survived secrets and mistakes and the passage of time. A little boy who would grow up knowing he was cherished by both his parents. A future full of possibilities they would face together. 6 years ago, Callista had thought her story with Bennett was over before it had truly begun. She'd been wrong. They hadn't been ending anything that night. They'd been creating the foundation for something beautiful and lasting. They'd been creating their beginning. As the sun set over Savannah, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, the Monroe-Carrington family headed home together, to yellow cottages and dinosaur collections, to bedtime stories and morning coffee, to all the small, precious moments that make up a life well lived. They had found their way back to each other, and this time they were never letting go. The end. If you were Callista and found out you were pregnant after one magical night with a powerful CEO who treated you like a stranger the next morning, what would you do? 5 years later, when fate brought them back together, she finally got the family of her dreams. But was it worth carrying such a heavy secret for so long? Tell us, what would be your decision in this situation? How would you handle the fear, maternal protection, and hope for true love? Your participation in our channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.